Joining us now, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. He's also the author of the weekly Substack newsletter Home and Away, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and Hofstra University professor of law James Sample, an expert in constitutional law. David, I'll begin with you to help lay the groundwork here. What exactly do we know at this time about this CIA strike that took place last week?
So the CIA is declining to comment. As are members of Congress, this kind of strike, the Gang of Eight, this would be the members of Congress from both parties who serve on the intelligence committees and other senior congressional officials should know about these kind of strikes. The sense that they're not commenting suggests that they did occur. And since it would be classified and they can't comment on them, it was a dock that, as you've talked about, was apparently used by a cartel or drug traffickers to transit drugs out of Venezuela. But this is a dramatic escalation, A, because it's attack on Venezuela itself. B, it's a shift back to this idea of somehow pressuring the flow of drugs as a way to get at Maduro. And as you mentioned, the main thrust last week and what seemed to be a more effective tactic was trying to shut off the flow of oil from Venezuela. That's what really threatens the Maduro regime. And then our colleague, David Noriega, an MS Now reporter, he's heard from people who support aggressive action against Maduro that they're frustrated. They want the administration to be more aggressive in its use of force or more consistent in its tactics, and that this kind of back and forth and shifting in tactics and explanations may be emboldening Maduro.
You know, James, there are more than a few premises this administration has asked us to accept without sharing with us hard public evidence. But even if you're accepting or arguing that these people are terrorists or they are enemy combatants, is it legal to strike a dock in a sovereign nation?
The rhetoric and the labels help a lot in the court of public opinion. They may help ultimately in domestic courts as well. But on an international law level, let's be clear, there are two options. This is either illegal under international humanitarian law, which the United States subscribes to, or it's illegal under the law of armed conflict. One of those two scenarios applies. The United States is arguing in a secret OLC memo that no one has seen outside the administration that this is an armed conflict with Venezuela. Now, the administration certainly has the power to make that reality true. They can make that manifest, right, by creating an armed conflict. But if this is an international armed conflict and therefore subject to the law of armed conflict, these individual actions, for example, the boat strikes on individuals who at most, even under the allegations and even under the labels, are guilty of criminal activity. That is activity that is the subject of law enforcement, not murder.
Richard, look, the justification for these strikes, the story around these strikes just keeps shifting. First, of course, we're told this is all about the drug war. Then Susie Wiles, of course, close to Trump, leading operations in the White House. You know, she makes comments in that explosive Vanity Fair profile saying that this is about trying to make Maduro cry uncle. And then we start to hear people on the right, figures around President Trump and Trump himself, signal that, well, actually, this might be about oil and resources. Can you help me decode what's going on here?
The fourth option, which is all of the above. I think to some extent, in a very limited way, it's about drugs. It's much more about regime change and gaining access to Venezuelan oil. And I think that a big part of this administration's foreign policy has been what? It has been focusing on the Western Hemisphere, check. It has been commercial opportunity, check. It's also been about stopping immigration. Venezuela has lost over 8 million people over the last, 5 or 10 years. So it seems to me it's central to this administration's foreign policy. The real question is, what if small amounts of gradually increasing military force don't work? Gradualism, incrementalism allows the other side to adjust. So I'm not sure it's the wisest approach, but if a little bit of force doesn't work, well, then what? Do you back off or do you introduce a lot of force? This administration tends to be against large-scale interventions. So I know what they want. Again, like everything else in foreign policy, it's a means ends challenge. And I'm not sure the means and the ends are lining up here.
General Hertling, as you and I have talked about these strikes sort of one after another as they've occurred. And I'm curious if you're at all concerned about the role of military lawyers right now. Traditionally, at least the public assumes that they are involved in the planning, that they are assessing these actions before they actually happen. But are you at all concerned as you see all of this unfold that what they might actually be doing is finding the story, the justification after the fact?
Extremely concerned about it, Antonio. And it goes back to what David was saying about the legalities of international law, the legalities of armed conflict, the legalities associated with what is combat, what is declaring war on another country. Going into sovereign territory violates the UN Charter. It's what we've been talking about, what Russia has been doing for the past 4 years. So we have become somewhat like them in terms of what we're doing illegally to get that end state that Richard was just talking about. And when you talk end state, it's just not ends and means, it's also ways you do things. The other thing I'd bring up too is there's been a lot of talk about the term regime change. That's begun to roll off the tongues of policymakers and even cable news and campaign surrogates. That seems to be the mama bear on the menu of military options. It's less than a full-scale invasion, but it's more than a few boat strikes. But truthfully, regime change is not a military mission. When you start getting into that option where you're really talking about changing a regime, you're running into a whole lot of problem because there are things that have to be done at the State Department, within the intelligence community, to reinforce the military in terms of what they're doing, even if that's the mission you want to accomplish. And the administration doesn't seem to be doing any of those things beyond just using strikes. And that scares me as a military guy who knows the type of planning that goes into these kinds of operations.
I want to go back to the question of regime change in a moment. But James, if you were providing legal advice to a member of the military who's part of the chain of command here involved in these strikes, would you be concerned that they had personal liability for their actions?
I would be concerned. I think I'd be more concerned than seems to be the level of concern that has been the way in which this has been approached so far, at least based on reporting. We do get the sense that there have been some individuals along the chain of command and along the chain of legal advice who have expressed concerns. Those concerns, however, have been overruled, have been dismissed. And
we know from the reporting, too, that some of them are seeking outside counsel.
That's absolutely right. And we've obviously seen high-profile resignations in the military as well. So yes is the answer to the question, because basically what we're talking about here with respect to the sovereignty of a nation, look, Maduro is a well-regarded bad guy, right? That is fairly universally acknowledged at this point. But bad guy or not, this particular drone strike in the sovereign territory of another foreign country without that country's consent goes against Article 51 of the UN Charter. The United States isn't under attack in any credible way. And the individuals who are at sea, those are individuals who are miles and miles from any potential harm to the United States and could easily be interdicted without death. These are serious, serious matters as a matter of international law, and eventually, maybe if Congress does its job, as a matter of domestic law as well.
Richard, do you have questions about the role the CIA and the military may have played in this dock strike? It hasn't been entirely clear from the reporting exactly who was engaged in this action last week. And I think more broadly, I think it's just been interesting to see as the president sort of hinted toward a covert action there, a sort of an odd way to roll out this sort of information of this sort of level of gravity and seriousness. What does the CIA's potential involvement and activity in Venezuela right now signal to you about the bigger picture?
Look, there's nothing new about the CIA playing a paramilitary role around the world. That's been a trend in recent years. The president talking about it, it's an odd thing, an overt, covert action. Normally you do these things for reasons of deniability. We seem to want to have it both ways, to deny it, but also to put overt pressure on the regime. Again, our policy is one about ratcheting up the pressure. We can have long conversations about legality. I may disagree with the others here. I'm not sure attacking a place where, if you could prove that drugs were being unloaded meant to come to the United States, that's necessarily illegal. Sovereign governments have the obligation to make sure their territory is not used for things like terrorism or drugs that could kill Americans. So yeah, I would say that's something of a potential gray area. But I think the real conversation, as it always is less about law and it's more about policy. And are we likely to succeed? And if we do succeed, by the way, are we then home free? I mean, the history of regime change is, one, is it's awfully hard to do. And then two, managing the aftermath can in many ways be more difficult than actually ousting the old people in power.
David, to that point, you've covered many conflicts around the world. You certainly know that regime change is, to put it mildly, messy business, and the U.S. has a spotted track record there. So even if the Trump administration were to succeed in pushing Maduro out of the way, is it a guarantee that their preferred opposition leader would immediately take control of Venezuela and all would be well?
Sadly, no. A key institution here is the Venezuelan military. Maduro has increased the number of generals in the Venezuelan military. There are now 2,000 generals in the country's military, and they all get paid well and are loyal to him as a result. But one outcome here is, if Maduro leaves, would be just that a junta takes over, again, sort of de facto control by the military, and that doesn't lead to the results of the election. Maduro did lose the election last year. He's an authoritarian leader. He should leave power, but that doesn't mean that the opposition will take power. And one note on the CIA. Mark Polymeropoulos, a former CIA officer, and he was speaking with some former colleagues. They're very frustrated that President Trump has made this covert action public. Part of a covert action is to keep the enemy guessing and on edge about where and when and who did what. And that's sort of lost when it's made so explicitly. So, that's just one opinion from one group, but there's just huge amount of American attention focused on Venezuela right now, and it's not clear what our primary strategy is there.
General Hertling, what did you make of that? The way that the president rolled this information out, almost as though it was a throwaway comment, something, small that happened that he was a little proud of. This overt, covert thing. And then, just the bigger picture here of the way that the administration has marketed this campaign, too. I mean, the choice of videos that they've released, of course, one notorious video that they will not release, the kind of way in which they've marketed their actions in Venezuela. You see administration officials celebrating this on social media. Is this normal?
It's not normal at all, and especially what they choose to celebrate. There are some things they want to rapidly roll out on social media, the strikes against boats. There are other things which could be rolled out very quickly, which people have been asking for. Hey, let's see the second strike on that boat from October. So these are the kinds of things that are confusing to not only the Congress, but the American public. And as long as we're saying that, if I can just add one more thing. This may be politics for some, but it's legalities for others. And I would put the military in that category. The people pulling the trigger, the ones who are killing folks, are under legal constraints. And they will be the ones that suffer, as it's been in past war, when the soldiers are held accountable. So that's why you see sometimes Special Operations Command saying they're not going to comment on the things they've done, or whether or not the CIA was involved in it. This is the same thing as waterboarding was during the Iraq War. So all of these things, in terms of the way the administration are rolling different pieces of information out, and you're very smart to bring that up, have been counterproductive to people understanding what is happening right now. Who are in those boats? What kind of drugs are they transporting? There was a New York Times article this morning that suggests one of those boats was a fisherman carrying marijuana and not cocaine. So all of these things, bring about a lack of trust in both the operators and the intelligence community, as well as the administration. So we have to be very careful in terms of defining legalities. And truthfully, as a soldier, I don't care about politics. All I know is what I'm being ordered to do and whether it's a constitutionally correct legal order.
Right. James, one quick final thought before we have to go. Do you see this Venezuela story as part of a larger story that you and I have discussed in the past of this administration's effort to expand presidential executive powers? Do you see the sort of foreign interventionist piece as being connected to some of the other legal machinations of the Trump administration and the sort of vision that Trump and actors like Stephen Miller have had for what the presidency could be?
The answer to that, Antonia, is absolutely yes. And one of the things that they have not rolled out, by the way, when General Hertling was talking about what they've rolled out quickly and what they haven't rolled out, they have not rolled out. And in fact, they have refused to release the Office of Legal Counsel memo that details the basis for some of these strikes. But to your question, absolutely yes. And Stephen Miller, think about this. One way in which the Venezuela story connects to a story from earlier this year, if you think about the Alien Enemies Act deportations, when the individuals were transported to CICOT to be tortured on the basis of nothing more than a bare, naked, non-processed claim without evidence that they were members of Tren de Aragua. That was an invocation of the Alien Enemies Act from 1798. The reason that that was struck down by the Supreme Court was the lack of due process. When that case went back to the Fifth Circuit, the very conservative Fifth Circuit, the Fifth Circuit said that the Alien Enemies Act, as a substantive matter, could not be invoked because we were not in an armed conflict with Venezuela. If we get into an armed conflict with Venezuela, that creates the perfect scenario for Stephen Miller's deportations.
Wow. I will have to have you back to have a conversation about that extended piece. David Rode, Richard Haass, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and James Sample, thank you all so much for this important discussion. Up next.